My name's Justin Whitty, and I am the curator of the Cleve Carney Museum of Art, and I want to welcome you this afternoon for what was originally scheduled artist talk back in February, but we were snowed out. It's hard to believe since we had 70 degrees the other day, but this time of year is kind of crazy like that. It's my pleasure today to have you here to hear from the artist Ayanah Moor. Someone reminded me yesterday that in these academic introductions, sometimes just going through a long list of all an artist's accomplishments can get a little boring. So what I'd say is if you want to see more about Ayanah's work, you can visit our website. And there's also links to her website there. She has shown extensively throughout the country. But I do want to mention that when I first visited Ayanah's studio, this was back in 2019, I had known Ayanah's work mostly as installation, print, and drawing work. And she showed me her paintings, and I was blown away because what I saw was really one of the strongest painters I'd seen working in Chicago. And in that is because in painting, oftentimes people expect to have a direct depiction of an image. But I really value painting that is able to convey that process of discovery, questioning, and lingering that happens in their making, and also in our lives. Ayanah's paintings really balance between this beautiful aesthetic experience with key elements pointing to the very precise and intentional content within the work through collage, through the titles, through the pairings. And they ask the viewer to really spend time and navigate within them. And I think that's what really elevates them, besides the fact that they're just incredibly beautiful. So you don't want to hear from me. You're here to hear from Ayanah. So join me in welcoming to the stage Ayanah Moor.
Thank you so much, Justin. Can y'all hear me okay? My vertical challenge means that I'm only just past this podium, but I'm just going to work with that. Good morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday. There are many things you could be doing today instead of being here for this talk, and thank you to the faculty that assigned this as an event that your students had to attend. Thank you, Justin, for the really lovely introduction. And thanks to the College of DuPage and the museum and all of the people that played a role in bringing a kind of vision that we talk through to life, particularly really affecting the museum, the setup of the museum, the color of the museum. So I'm really grateful for that. It's going to take me a few moments to just adjust to my general awkwardness, the sound of the microphone, your wonderful faces, and the like, really being human up in here. So how many people consider themselves in some way artists, makers, creatives, whatever language you prefer to use? All right, awesome. And how many people are engaged in fields that might contrast to that, but nevertheless is important work? Engineering, sciences, waiting tables, public speaking. Okay, I just want to acknowledge the wide range of labor and action, culture making and place making and all those makings. I'm thinking about this presentation like many, which is an opportunity to in some way provide some context for what it is that I'm creating, how I'm thinking about it. A talk is also a space to work on language. For those of many of you who raise their hands, they're artists. Language that I've been thinking through, that I want to test out in a space like this. It's also an opportunity for a kind of vulnerability as you translate what's a visual experience with your artwork, and use these words, which kind of pale in comparison to the physical confrontation of your body with the work. So I'm going to ask for your grace a little bit as I embrace introducing some things that I'm thinking through and learning about, because even after you make your work, depending on your attitude, you can still learn from it. You can still learn when you're in conversation with someone in front of your work. And how you felt when you made it may shift a month later, a year later. So all of that is in play. So I'm going to do a bit of an experiment and ask that you work with me. And then afterwards, there'll be some Q&A, and then we'll also hang out in the museum should anyone have any follow-up questions. Does that sound good? Right. Ain't no mountain high enough, ain't no valley low enough, ain't no river wide enough to keep me from getting to you, babe. That may resonate with some of you, and that might not with others, and that's okay, because there are times when your ability to access a certain kind of language is just that, your ability to access it. And some things may be inaccessible, and that's also okay. Ain't no mountain high enough. Ain't no valley low enough. Ain't no river wide enough to keep me from getting to you, babe, sung by Tammy Terrell and Marvin Gaye in 1967. And later by Diana Ross in 1970, a pretty significant hit for her in 1970. I was born in 1973. The double negative, a regional dialect such as Southern American English or African American English. The double negative, a twist of English creating bold declarations, emphasis or affirmation. A subtraction of the land, a cutting into. I am often cutting into, inserting myself into art histories, popular culture, and social histories. This cutting into will be a theme, a thread that you can identify through various pieces that I'm going to share with you. There is an inside and an outside in this painting. There is an awkwardness in this painting. There is a suggestion, there is an intimacy, there is a figuration, there is a geometric abstraction. There are times in which I'm interested in contradictions in a singular work and creating a problem for myself. And that problem may be one that I solve, that I remedy, or that just continues to be a problem. I had the great fortune of visiting Michael Heiser's double negative site over the December kind of Christmas holiday winter break, and had been very excited about experiencing this location, only seeing it photographed, as much of our introduction to art history is based in some kind of image, textbook, image online. And what was really striking is, of course, knowing the kinds of permissions that needed to be granted in order to view this great mesa, this great tabletop, as a site in which one could make art through cutting into. And so compositionally, there might be some parallels that you see between that landscape. But that's a little bit of my invention afterwards in finding this image to pair with the painting. I'll say that in my imagination, there are things about being at the site with my Black body and all my humanity and feeling really afraid, and being with a friend and their white-bodiedness and all their humanity and navigating this public site and thinking about that and thinking about permission and what it means to visit a public place. So the pairing here happened afterwards, but in my imagination, there was a resonance that I think led to the composition of the painting. Revising and countering and altering and subverting and being demonstrative. I also had the fortune of visiting Valley of Fire. It's a public recreation nature preserve. It's located in the Mojave Desert. And apart from trying to create a cute selfie, I'm thinking about the shapes inside and outside, potentially what it means to define landscape as the physical features of the land, but also the cultural implications of human presence. Who is welcome to be there, who is expected to be there, what are the politics of being within that site. And so there's a quality of exploring shapes inside and outside, and also allowing certain elements within the painting to be unnamed, to not have an explanation, to navigate a space that feels in some ways becoming or unfinished or questioning completion. There's something about a kind of queering, which is an unfixed state of becoming. And so thinking about suggesting the landscape with my body, suggesting the qualities within a painting that have a landscape reference, but also just do what painting does, which is to be flat, and to present a certain kind of materiality, and also ultimately to talk about time. Painting always talks about time. I'm just checking in. I'm wondering how the experience is for you. There's light flooding here, and there's also light coming from there. Can you see everything okay? Awesome. Excellent. So that quality of presence and suggestion of landscape, I think, can also be read in this painting, where compositionally there are devices that are being used that allow a certain kind of structure to build the painting, the actions that are happening at the top that have that quality of time in terms of the kind of pooling and dripping and movement. And then the kind of landscape reference that automatically happens when you put a circle within a field. And it's such a simple gesture, but if the color combination is such, there'll be an effect, like a vibrancy or a charge or a thing as your eye is trying to negotiate the color relationships. There's also the incorporation of this magazine page that forces you to kind of not get lost in the abstraction. This is maybe another example of the problems that I like to create for myself, where this kind of worldly material, this material that is not of me. It's based on research, it's based on finding something, and then allowing whatever agenda that material had to in some way have to kind of negotiate with the painting. And in acquiring that material, there's a cutting into, there's an intimacy of the blade across the paper to select it and to place it within the painting. I'm going to complicate that even further by talking about it as a kind of black currency, that there's automatically a suggestion of value when I locate this image within the painting. And then that brings up some interesting questions for me around black citizenship, what it means to sell a product, what it means to be a model in service of selling a product. I also just think those colors look really cool together. So abstraction interrupted by representation is something that I'm thinking through quite a bit. The landscape also of home is really influential in my work and my paintings, because I'm often thinking about the space around the painting. And maybe that's a question for some students to consider, to imagine the space that your work is going to be in, to create a home for your work to be in. Maybe that question is in operation with one particular project. I'm not suggesting that it be your entire practice, but it can be an exercise that raises the stakes in a way. And of course, making space, making home involves a lot of touch. And in particular, I'm thinking about home, black domestic spaces as a space in which there is a degree of control and a degree of resistance against the outside world's narrative or projections or myths or traumas. And so the home space is this incredible space in which there can be a curation of images and experiences in which there is a lot of beauty. And so thinking about that in my own home space, there's a lot of building relationships between objects that I've acquired, art collection that I have been building, my own work, but also what it might suggest in terms of the beauty of caring for one's home, the beauty of making a bed, the beauty of vacuuming your floor, the beauty of wiping a countertop. I'm interested in all of those as touches, as aesthetics, as forms of care that also are reflected in the way that I make artwork. Again, revising, countering, altering. Landscape as the features of a particular situation or activity or intellectual activity. Good News is a monochromatic installation that focuses on bold, black, queer loving. Ultimately, it is using a compositional device that also references a certain kind of minimalist art, if you will, a kind of veneer of conceptualism. There is a grid that creates an installation, and in this case, a corner in which the viewer would be about in the center and really in the middle of the artwork. Each page has a statement. This one says, Oakland. A lot of Black women are in Oakland, many of them in positions of leadership. This area attracts people who do unusual things, people who take chances. Black women here save their nickels and dimes and open their own businesses. And so this is Brenda's assessment of the potential dating pool in the city in which she lives. It's a bit pre-social media. It requires that you ask, what's the dating scene like in this neighborhood? And someone gives you their word of mouth evaluation. Right now, word of mouth is typically a phrase that you get as a set of options of how did you learn about this service. And it'll have online, email, and all the way at the bottom, word of mouth. This is again, another example of the revising, the countering, the altering, the subversiveness, the demonstrative, coding and queering. So this feature showcases eligible Black men in Ebony magazine. And there's a fine line, which I can't zoom in, but it says that these men are models. These men are not actually eligible, which, depending on the reader, is a huge letdown. But you can see how dashing they are and how well dressed. And they're businessmen and they're ready for whatever. And the other spread has the actual evidence of the women who offered their assessments. And you can see that they're all smiling and they're all ready. And they're beautiful. And there is an opportunity to imagine presence, to insert myself into, and to imagine all the ways of Blackness, which can be hetero and can be queer and can be all the ways. And so it becomes a fun little device to reimagine that spread and to do some subtle shifts like change the gender and to slightly alter the name of the speaker so that one might be able to imagine themselves within a publication that is really marketed as being of me and for me. Black Square, Kazimir Malevich, the first modern monochromatic artwork, an avant-garde masterpiece. The failure of the Black Square to represent anything beyond itself, to achieve ultimate flatness, and to discover that in the pure square pigment, unmediated, that Malevich also hand wrote under a top coat of black paint a joke about how black it was, like Negroes fighting in a cave. So I'm often revising, countering, altering, subversive and demonstrative, coding and queering. New Orleans, there's no wife material in New Orleans. Most of the women want more than one woman. They play the field because they have their choice of women. I wouldn't recommend New Orleans to single women looking for a woman. So funny. I like how my microphone started to dip down as I tried to tell that joke, which is now just more like my height. it's still working though, still working pretty well, okay. Sojourner Truth, who wrote and lectured extensively in support of the liberation of African Americans, is shown here, seated with her handiwork. A Black woman, middle class and educated, this portrait was copyrighted by Truth and sold. This passage is particularly striking for me because Truth is recounting being a child enslaved. And she's describing the conditions, the slave master that owned her parents and other enslaved people passed, and then his son owned the property, the human property, and the conditions that the son used to house these people was deplorable. And so Sojourner describes this, and she was referred to as Belle during this time. Many years later, Belle shivered whenever she remembered, I'm gonna do it like this, whenever she remembered the cold dampness of the cellar's dirt floors. 12 people shared the common space with no room for privacy. Ventilation was poor, and lighting was even poorer since the only windows were tiny slits in the wall. In the summer, it was miserably hot, humid, and smelly, so most of the time, the slaves, the enslaved people, slept outside. During the winter, they huddled together around a fire in the middle of the room to escape the bitter cold. They used board planks as beds. Years later, Belle remembered that even though the cellar was terrible, she was surrounded by her parents' love, and that made it bearable. So that's really resonant for me as I think about my family history. How many descendants of immigrants are in the room? All right, that's right. We are, the U.S. is often called a nation of immigrants, right? This seems like familiar language. And it is true, but if we limit it to that, we are erasing millions of people who are the descendant of enslaved people like me, proudly. And so Sojourner's story, that little passage is so resonant as I reimagine the love that is also in the home that my ancestors lived in, which is behind the mansion, and the governor of North Carolina lived there with his family. And thinking about the house behind the big house as a site of which there is love that makes it bearable is very inspiring, because I wouldn't be here if there weren't love. So I'm really interested in that, that additional layer, right? My story is not one of trauma, is not limited to horror. So this is the image that Sojourner Truth copyrighted and sold as a means to fund her abolitionist work. She was born into slavery in 1797 and escaped bondage with her daughter, and later fought for the abolition and voting rights for blacks. And how sophisticated it is that she was once human property, but now she controlled her image and profited from the sale of her likeness. And the poetry of the text, I sell the shadow to support the substance, is just an incredible way of framing that complicated history. revising and countering and altering, subversive and demonstrative, coding and queering. Someone you know, or the longer message, someone you know sells Avon. That's going to resonate with some of you and not with others. A pyramid scheme or entrepreneurialism, a small business venture, intergenerational dialogue, same gender conversations, painting on the face, painting in the studio, connecting through precarious materials. There's almost like a screen of black strokes that seem to create this challenge in seeing the color that's underneath, or the color is battling to be seen, or there's a screen that complicates your looking. But also within my imagination, this incredible advertisement in which there is a similar kind of palette, very different garments, and to have those colors kind of reflected in the painting. The studio space, the space of Instagram, another site to explore touch, to create relationships between objects, to play, to experiment, and sharing when the work leaves the studio, when the sharing happens, it means that you don't have total control over the meaning, which makes a form like this a special opportunity, again, to kind of extend the language of the work. And there also is a letting go when the work is in public. But in the studio, and even in the space of the curated photograph within Instagram, there is a kind of reveal that is happening as much as there is a well-curated display. Pink like lotions and creams and moisturizers and rubs, touch and caress, to care for, self-care, the body, my body. The painting has a cutting from an ebony magazine, but it also has reproductions of reproductions. So the larger digital print is creating the background. And there's also an odd shape that has almost like a floor plan kind of quality. An inside and an outside, a suggestion of a space, but also an odd shape that interrupts the photographic elements. Ebony Magazine was founded in 1945, and the ads reflect the influence of the people who dominate you. They reflect the aesthetics of your oppressors, and colorism is a byproduct of that whiteness. And archives are records that show shifts in language and identity and self-worth and anti-blackness and black uplift. Portraits that highlight biases that have been taught, that play with the fallacy of race, and portraits that are in response to other artists' portraits that showcase the difference between the hand, in the case of a drawing, a self-portrait, and the machine, a silkscreen. They also talk about touch and authorship and authorship and authority. And so again, I'm revising and countering and altering, subversive and demonstrative, coding and queering. That play of beauty in this work and also blackness and how that's perceived. That the before would be with less alteration, and the after is also within an increasingly black space. Beauty is my business, to put a face on, to paint as armor, to create, to prepare for battle, to contradict, to sell product. I do want to sell these paintings. Portraiture, home space, collection, my artwork in the homes of friends, and the clever play of portraiture from the description of a Jet magazine centerfold to a portrait of myself through someone else's body. For you, for you, for you, you for this is just blackness. Is blackness for you just this? This blackness is just for you. For you, this blackness just is. Works in dialogue recur in my practice. Another question for students: how to make the work public and distributable? How to invite a response to the work? In this case, how to invite a musician to respond to your work as a way of extending the form to another platform, from the platform of CTA to the platform of a streaming service. How to be inspired by the setting that the work is in. How to play with notions of public. How does all that you have heard impact your looking when no photograph is present? What meanings do the composition, color, and treatment communicate? I am always revising, countering, altering, subversive and demonstrative coding and querying. What do you bring to the experience of looking and being with? Those are all my comments. Thanks so much. Polite applause. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's 11:40. I went 5 minutes over my goal.
It's okay, I think we have time for questions, but since we don't have a mic out here, if you could repeat any questions you're answering so we know.
All right. I'm happy to take a few questions. Justin says we have time. We can also hang out in the museum. Yes. What exactly does the quote, "this blackness is just for you," mean? The thing that interests me sometimes is to create an opportunity for the viewer or listener to explore within themselves the meaning. So it would be less interesting for me to tell you what to think, and much more interesting for me to force you to interrogate meanings that you have been fed. I think that's also in play in the portraits by Adrian Piper and Glenn Ligon, because what they do is force you to interrogate what the exaggeration is. They force you to scrutinize your impolite understanding of racial hierarchy. And Glenn does it in this really sophisticated way, because then he uses a photograph, 2 photographs, 1 photograph 2 times. So I see the work that you're asking about as an extension of the device in these 2 artists' work. I see the work that you're asking about as an extension of the device that these 2 artists are using. You're welcome. How'd I do? Thumbs up. Was that a question? Oh, thank you. Thank you. Justin Whitty.
Yeah, I found it really interesting when in describing your work by saying representation interrupting abstraction. I think especially in the history of abstract painting, where a lot of early American painters also lived very closeted lives, and that kind of represented in their work. Think of Johns and how potentially camouflaged his paintings were. Now that we know more about his life, how that really reflected how he lived. And I think that language, like so much of your language, is so important of representation interrupting the abstraction. And I'm wondering if you think about in those paintings abstractly representing something broader than just your interaction within those material compositional spaces.
I'm wondering if abstraction represents more than just in those paintings.
Talking about the representation interrupting the abstraction, I wonder if you could talk about what other abstractions may be.
Talk more about other abstractions of representation.
That in the paintings, talk about what that abstraction is. So if your representation is interrupting it, what else that could represent?
I did a horrible job of recapping Justin's question. Did you hear Justin's question? I had so much fun with this image. I love Malevich's Black Square so much. And the notion of explaining how black something is by describing black people fighting is both a racist joke and an abstraction. It's like, no, it's this black. So there's something about an artist in relation to a humorist. This Elias person is also creating that kind of humor with the Negroes fighting in a cellar at night. And so I'm really interested in the abstracting of something. That the abstraction is just not out here. I think that's what this in a way points to. The abstraction is not just out here. It is in the world with the rest of us. And so there are times in which I'm really interested in thinking through what I'm abstracting. That the blackness as a construction is a kind of abstraction of an African experience, of an American experience. My ancestors have been here since the late 1700s. So I'm interested in my identity as a kind of abstraction and playing with that. Is that? Hey.
You talk a lot in your pieces about your blackness and how you are black and how that affects you in your day-to-day life and public spaces in the U.S. and especially your ancestors. And my apologies if I'm assuming this wrong, but I also assume you are queer. And I see a lot of your blackness. I see a lot of your history, a lot of where that comes from through your art. But how do you feel? How do you My apologies. How do you feel that you bring across that queer element in your pieces when I feel like I very visually see the blackness and the communities you come from and the ancestors and public spaces?
Thank you for that question. It's a really good question. You know, in thinking through this exhibition, the part about my family history was not central. When Justin came to my studio, as I recall, I had some paintings going, and we had this really, vibrant kind of conversation about the paintings. And it was only later that I began to think about what opened up that allowed me to revisit painting. My early training is in painting and printmaking, but then I stopped painting right after grad school. Right before grad school, I stopped painting, actually. And as I kind of thought through what led up to me making these paintings again, I thought about this image of the cabin and this kind of narrative around love that led to me painting upon that image. And so, in a way, I was really kind of cautious about how much to front load the personal history part. Typically don't like the Black History Month show invitations, not because that isn't a significant time to celebrate the contributions of people who've been here since the beginning of the country. But the framing sometimes screws up how the work can be talked about and how the work can be used by an institution. So there is an aspect of the story, the framing of the exhibition, which has that layer, but that is a space in which I want to also be careful. Like, I'm thinking about it as this kind of joyous, liberatory layer. And I can spend just as much time talking about my aesthetic decisions, my compositional choices, palette, and things of that nature. So I'm trying to thread this in this really delicate way. But as you begin to question my investment in images of femmes and women, there is the loving, right? So there is by the sheer use of the images that are designed to be selling a product, but also have a gaze that directly looking at one is a gaze that, for me, I'm engaged in a kind of coding that's quite queer, or I'm interested in images that supposedly have the same person, but could also be a way of talking about same gender love. So I think that's also at play a little bit in Ligon's image, and then in this image for me. It is a quality that is subversive. I think the queers get it. I think that even in your courageous question, and naming all the things that are in play as I present myself, that you picked up on that queerness is no accident. You know? You know? Exactly, exactly. And so the folks that can read that, you know? Okay, thank y'all. I appreciate you so much.
We will be in the museum galleries if you guys want to come and ask Ayanah any other questions. You're welcome to. Otherwise, thank you very much.
Thanks so much for coming.